In a time full of remakes and remasters and re releases with movies and video games, and now action figures, it looks like Mafex is also going back to the drawing board with their Ben Affleck Batman from the Zack Snyder Justice League with a 2.0 revision of the original. How does it compare? A quick breakdown of my timeline with Mafex's portrayal of the Ben Affleck Batman, whether it be from Justice League or BVS. I frankly missed both of them almost completely when they were initially released. But since then, it looks like Mafex themselves wanted to kind of make sure they really got it right with the version of the Justice League Batman, especially since its filmmaker, Zack Snyder, did in fact come back to deliver a 4-hour cut of that initial film of what he really truly intended for it to be. So Mafex followed suit by delivering a 2.0, and when this got unveiled and pre-orders went up, trust me, my pre-order went down right through Hobbylink Japan and got myself the 2.0 version, as you see before you right here, since I did initially miss out on the 1.0. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, I am the comparison guy. We gotta be making comparisons, especially with exactly what it is that they fixed this time around. Because by himself, you can see right here that this is actually a pretty impressive Ben Affleck Batman right here, as far as physicality, presentation, just the way that he comes across, with the way that they were able to really translate the mass, the imposing nature that he had in those movies. Granted, he did slim down a little bit more when it came to the Justice League movie as opposed to how he looked like in BVS, but here you see an awful lot of the musculature, the physique, a little bit more of the whiteness to his character as far as the broadness of his shoulders, the biceps, the musculature around the thighs. But then you see an awful lot of those traits that, as I mentioned before, not only with my recent Funjoy Justice League Batman review, but also with some other versions of the character, and maybe even in some passing anecdotes during other reviews that relate to Ben Affleck's Batman, or when I was doing a live stream or whatnot. I would often remark that the Justice League suit that Ben Affleck wore wasn't necessarily my favorite version of the suit because of all the extra little panels that they added, the lining, the slimming down of the suit. I'm just more in favor of the BVS suit as far as just how reminiscent of the Dark Knight Returns suit it truly is, but also just the way that it makes him look even downright scary in certain instances, whether it be the warehouse fight or his first appearance when the cops find him up in the roof and he's kind of skulking around like an animal, like a literal rodent bat, so to speak. So I really did like that incarnation, don't get me wrong. So when we got to Justice League, even if it's the Zack Snyder version, I felt like they kind of funneled down his design. But at least Mafex here, as far as the 6-inch or maybe even a little less than that, probably about 5.5-ish inch scale market, you can see right here that this is a very presentable figure as far as how he looks like with the sculpting, with the detail. But something was in fact just a little off, even seeing him from an isolated standpoint. And that's got to be the color scheme. Even without having to do any kind of comparison just yet, I can tell that the bluish nature of his suit is just a little too blue here. If I remember correctly, he leans a little bit more towards like a purplish black with that Justice League suit as opposed to the lightish gray that he had in BVS. Or if anything, maybe he had a very slight blue hue to the suit that he had in BVS. And it looks like they carried that hue into this 2.0 for the Zack Snyder version of the character as far as the 2021 4-hour cut release. And I don't know if maybe Mafex, I don't know if their source material or their referencing images were put through a different monitor that maybe had something a little aloof with the color correction or whatnot. But there's just something about the bluish hue right here that I feel is just slightly inaccurate. I don't know how well it's coming across on camera, because here's the thing. There's so much being carried on over from the physicality and the texture work that's at play here. But if you guys really want to know what I'm talking about, then yes, this is the point where we have to bring in the 1.0. And some of you may already be wondering, didn't you already say at the beginning of the video that you missed the 1.0? Yeah, I did. And for the sake of the review and for very conscious posterity here to make sure that the comparison was done right, I bought myself an aftermarket one. This came off of a seller off Mercari, and if you're going to be able to see here in later B-roll shots of the figure, you're going to notice that there's an abundance of flaking on the cape. I'll go ahead and tackle that right now. The cape is flaked to It really is. It's terrible. But I bought it knowing that ahead of time. It was on the product page, and because of that, I got a good deal. Trust me, this was not at all anywhere near MSRP. And plus, I think the seller also knew that they had a 2.0 on the way, and they probably had a pre-order locked for it down pat. So at that point, he was like, all right, yeah, I'll give it to you for a good price. And so I thought to myself, okay, for the necessity, for the content, I'll pull the trigger on it and bring it here on screen to exactly kind of articulate what I'm talking about as far as that blue color hue. Because once you see these guys next to each other, you kind of see a little bit of what I'm talking about as far as that color discrepancy. You'll notice that the original 1.0 has probably a bit more of an accurate look to the color that he had in the original Justice League movie as opposed to how it looked like on the 2.0 here. The 2.0, if anything, the 2.0 is kind of mimicking a color scheming similar to a little bit more closer resembling the BVS suit. So it's almost like, like I said, like maybe there was just a slight bit of mistranslation. I don't know what the case may be. Both are probably harnessing a good amount of that really good texture work as far as how you see a little bit more of that compacted and very condensed texture that he had on the new Justice League suit as opposed to like the lines and the ridges that he had on the BVS version. But what I really dig about either one that I think was they were able to retain and really makes or breaks certain Mafexes and kind of gives you an idea of what you're really paying for in that prosumer tier is really the shading, where they make sure that the color is kind of muted down wherever you have crevices that then kind of emphasize a little bit of the musculature underneath, specifically around the abdominal area. Yes, on both of the figures, you can definitely tell that you still have an awful lot of that paneling and lining and things like that I'm not the biggest fan of, but I do like that they were able to coordinate the paint applications downright to make sure that you have an emphasis on the abdominals, the obliques, the pecs, the chest, everything, and it really just makes the figure pop a whole lot more. Even if I really still prefer that we had this color scheme, but then on this body. Because when you see the 1.0 versus the 2.0, you can definitely see exactly what they reworked as far as the physicality. It's funny because when I first got this guy, which I definitely got first because he came in the aftermarket through Mercari, so he got shipped to me in a few days, whereas this guy I only got recently. But even then, I can tell that this guy desperately needed the 2.0 due to how completely feeble and weak and rather skinny by comparison he looked like based off of the photos alone. I can see that a little bit of the shoulder area, the biceps, and most definitely the abdominal torso area was just way too narrow and way too slimmed down to be resembling any kind of, kind of imagery from the Ben Affleck version of Batman, whether it be from BBS or from Justice League, or even from The Flash. And that's where most of the overhaul came in with the 2.0, where you have the much more wide torso. You see an awful lot of bulk to the abdominals, the chest, the shoulders, like I mentioned before, and the biceps. You see more of a triangular kind of imposing nature that mimics how he looked like in the movie versus the 1.0. And even in certain areas where the changes are very, very minimal to the point where maybe through the naked eye you can't really see up until you literally stack the figures on top of each other and see that they kind of added probably just even less than a millimeter of mass to the thighs. They almost look identical, but and trust me, it's a little difficult to kind of maybe show off a little on camera. You might not be able to see, but in person, I can see that it's just a little wider of thigh muscle on the legs themselves. As far as the gauntlets and the boots, they almost look identical, but similar thing. Once I kind of put them right next to each other, I feel like a little bit was added to the boots themselves as far as not only mass and plastic allocation, but also the paint applications to make sure that it's got more of a smoother finish. Same thing with the gauntlets. You have an awful lot of more prominence when it comes to the straps that are kind of wrapping around the gauntlets themselves. A little bit more of a saturated look to the color scheming as far as that very copperish airbrush nature to not only the knuckles, but also the gauntlets where the spikes are at. You can see that you have a little bit more of color embedded into them, which is kind of strange to say considering that they completely omitted the copper tones on the tips of the boots. There's absolutely none. It's completely missing on the new one. You have a bit more refinement when it comes to that black sheen on the shoes and the boots themselves, but no copper accents. So I thought that was kind of interesting that they completely cut that out. I don't know if it's screen accurate. I never really paid too much attention to his boots in the movie, but I do know that the ones that were on the gauntlets were present and they retained those. It also looks like they overhauled a little bit of the belt itself. Not only is it a little bit wider, it looks almost identical to the naked eye as far as sculpting, but you'll notice that there's a few changes done here and there. And to me, what really stood out to me the most is that they kind of pulled back a little bit more on those copper accents to make sure that everything felt balanced as far as the black versus the airbrushed copper metal that you have going on for the belt itself. And even the bat symbol, frankly, I feel like it was done a whole lot better, though I didn't really mind the very matted finish to the bat symbol on the original. There's something about the texturized version on the new one that, yeah, I think it's a little closer to the BVS, similar to the bluish tone that he had going on, where those are the two main elements where I'm like, I feel like that's more BVS than Justice League. But as far as the technical aspects of adding that bat symbol on there, it just looks a whole lot better as far as what they were able to do, refining the technique. Whereas over here, it just looks like a standard sculpting of the plastic there to give it an airbrush, or I'm sorry, a matted look on top of the surface. Here, it just added this level of complexity to make it look a little bit more alive. And up until this point, it really did look like a very thorough improvement, despite the color discrepancy and a pullback on some of the copper accents. And even the cape itself looks very, very refined as far as harnessing a little bit on the wiring for the outer rims. It is a little longer, though I could have done without the tattered look here towards the end tips of the cape itself that is also carried on over from the 1.0. Didn't really like it on the 1.0 from when I was playing with him because it just looks too tattered. I felt like by the time he got to Justice League, his cape was a little bit on the cleaner side. But at least I know this could maybe come off as a bit of a hot take. Still really like the pleathery look here on the top, even though I know that it's very subject to flaking, just like this one does. Because this one, like I've shown off before, it is completely obliterated, eviscerated, if you will. And I know that this one still has a little bit of a risk of that happening, but of course, it really depends on the collector. I gotta be honest, I'm not gonna speak for my mans who had this prior to me, but I just know that I'm not gonna be handling my figures terribly crazy when it comes to cape posability, but at least here you have a little bit more of a stagnant way to keep things very stiff in motion and keep maybe flaking at a minimal via the wires that you have here on the side that are pretty strong. They could be a little bit more rigid, but they're definitely a lot better than even like Fonjoy's, for example. So at least I like that they incorporated some of the wiring that was missing from the 1.0 back into the cape. A little bit of tailoring could have been a bit more beneficial towards the 2.0 because I do feel like it's a little long. However, that's not my biggest problem with the 2.0 because, like I said, up until this point, we were actually doing a pretty good job of improving almost every single facet of the figure from the 1.0. But to me, the buck kind of stops, quite literally the buck, with the head sculpt. Yeah, I don't know what it is, but I kind of like the 1.0 a little bit better as far as the head sculpt. Sure, the judgment is still out as to whether or not it truly resembles Ben Affleck, because I feel like at this point, we really do need to kind of hit the Wayback Machine to see exactly which figures probably benefited from still honing in on the likeness when it was hot back in 2021 when the Zack Snyder cut was coming out. Because since then, it looks like a lot of companies suffered with the loss of the license. And it looks like maybe, pure speculation, we're adding Mafex to that list. Because this new version, despite having much more saturated color tones to the skin tone on the mouth plate, the sculpting being pretty decent for the cowl itself, I feel like the angular look to the original and the pointiness of the ears, and then just overall the complexion of the mouth plate that I feel gets a little closer to Affleck's likeness. It's not one-to-one dead on. It's not. It's still imperfect. But I'm just saying, comparing to the new 2.0, I'll gladly do a head swap here, which thankfully you can do at least on the top pegs of the neck. I've already tried it, and yeah, it frankly does do a little bit of a night and day difference. If anything, it almost perfects this new version if it wasn't for, like I said, the color discrepancy of having this be a little bit too bluish for my liking, this being the version from Justice League as opposed to being the BVS version. So if we could have this head in this colorway, but on this body with all of these different refinements, guys, we would have truly the definitive Ben Affleck Batman. Which is a shame too, because the articulation is just as good, and it's not necessarily better because I feel like they just carried on over an awful lot of the points that worked for the 1.0. But I think what makes this whole endeavor a little bit impressive is because they added more mass. So generally when you add mass to a figure, it limits the articulation, but here I feel like it's pretty much just kind of translated one-to-one. As far as the head, it's able to rotate at the top neck joint, so to speak, with the dumbbell joint or piece that's inside of there. A little bit of tilting would have been better as far as going down on the top joint, but it's a little bit more alleviated by the bottom part of the neck piece that's able to move and kind of crunch inwards at the base of, or at the bottom of the neck, base of the shoulders. So you're able to do a little bit more tilting via that piece up and down and even side to side. But like I said, rotation is still pretty nice, and even a little bit of additional tilting via the top head joint at the top of the neck. But just know that when you press a little too far, it's going to remove the head, and obviously that's constructed there for obvious reasons. Arms are fully able to rotate 360, though because of the way that the cuff here that allows the butterfly movement is sculpted in a very cone-line manner, you kind of have to kind of inch the arm and rotate it outwards towards the sides to get the full rotation 360, but it can be done. And then, like I just kind of alluded to there before, there's a little bit of a butterfly joint happening with this little washer piece that's embedded inside, so they can kind of flex a little forwards and a little back, right about right there. Biceps are still able to rotate 360 there, and despite how massive the bicep is, it can actually fully rotate no problem, very fluidly. The two joints at the elbows can fully bend almost all the way up. They just kind of stop right there short because of the aforementioned bicep and the way that it's constructed, but it can still be done and it's achievable. The wrist can definitely still allow the hand to rotate full 360 as well as slightly bend inwards and outwards. However, much like an awful lot of prosumer figures, whether it be Mafex or Figure Arts or hell, even Funjoy recently, when you kind of press a little bit too far on that hinge, it does come at the risk of starting to peel back and kind of loosen up the hand and have it come off, because it's using this kind of design to the joint where it's simply just a stick. It's not really a peg, so it doesn't really have like a rounded tip that kind of keeps it in place or pops it in place back on when you put the hand back on. So unfortunately that's not there. It just kind of slides back in. So very easy for functionality later on when we cover accessories, but not to kind of keep you from detaching it when moving the wrist about. So just mind that. However, moving on to what I consider to be one of my more favorable joints out of the whole set here would have to be this torso cut that you have via this kind of upside down U, where you are able to kind of rotate the torso almost to 360. I get a little bit of resistance there due to the way of how much more massive, because you can definitely achieve it with the 1.0. I've already tried it. But with the 2.0, because they added the mass, like I mentioned before, it does kind of limit a little bit of the movement. It can almost rotate the full 360 this way. Actually, hold on. It's a little scary, but you can do it. I just did it. There you go. So you can do it. I just found that out right now, actually. I knew that you can get pretty far, but I didn't know you could do the full rotation. You just have to slightly do a little bit of crunching to kind of shift the top part of the body right here, or the torso rather, to then kind of just make way due to the way that everything is just kind of, like I said, designed and cupped right around right here due to how much more massive his torso really is. And speaking of crunching, like I said, you can really crunch pretty decently towards the front and kind of extend towards the back, but you do get a little bit of a gap right there above the panels once where this whole area kind of cuts near the diaphragm area. But of course, you can extend the crunching forwards and backs via the waist articulation, the waist cut that you have right there. And technically, you can also rotate the full 360 on the waist itself as well. Just mind that they went with this really strange way of adding the belt where it's loose from the front, but it's glued on to the back. So whenever you do any kind of like waist movement, you'll notice that it kind of pulls the belt with it. And that kind of also gives us a peek into the gap cut right about right there. That kind of ruins a little bit of the illusion. So just be careful with that if you want to kind of press that down. But at the same time, I feel like the fact that the belt is not glued all the way through can also pose a risk of it detaching from the back and then maybe coming loose or having some wear and tear or creating a little bit of a defect. So just be careful. And you can still technically crunch on the obliques side to side and kind of get a little bit more extensive with it via the waist joint. But just mind that it's creating a little bit of a cut here on the sides to where it's literally just shifting the top torso piece downwards like so. So just be careful when that is happening. Legs are pretty flexible as well. They can kind of bend almost at the full 90-degree angle forward and even get pretty far back, though it's funny because they opted for the dumbbell kind of design to the joint right there, where of course you're going to have not only a little bit of a drop down function, but it also allows pretty decent extension towards the sides. You just kind of have to like extend it a little bit and kind of futz with it to kind of flex downwards and allow this extension to take place like that. But when you do it, there's quite a lot of gappage happening here between the diaper piece and the legs themselves. And the amount of gappage that's happening, I feel like that should allow, so it's decent when it comes to flexing towards the sides and towards the back, but it stops a little shorter than I would have wanted to if it's going to be creating all of this. You get me? Like, if I don't mind this, I know, hot take, a lot of people do, but to me, I would say I don't mind this if I can go further with the leg, and I can't. You know, if it's gonna stop right there, then I kind of expect this to be shifted up a little higher right there and just kind of stop short right there to make sure that it doesn't look as ugly as possible, especially if I'm going to be putting it in a pose that needs one of the legs to be extended towards the back and then the other one extending forward. Then at the same time, I don't want to create that. You know what I'm saying? So it has to be a little give and take, and I feel like they took more than they gave when it comes to those top leg joints. So that's probably the only area that I will have to fault a little bit as far as the 2.0's new articulation, or rather carried on articulation, that needed probably a little bit of extra retooling. But at least I don't have to say that about the knees that feel really good in hand to bend upwards almost all the way up via the two joints that you have right there that are very fluid. Like I said before, I've always praised Mafex's knee joints for having that fluidity and that really good feeling on the hand whenever you move the joints about and feel like they're very snug and tight and never feel like they're going to wear and tear as long as you don't go crazy with them. And the ankles can still be able to rotate the 360 at the ball joint, though mine is a little scary with the right because it feels almost a little too tight, a little ratcheted there. The left one's a little bit more complementary as far as rotation, but both of them can still pivot upwards and downwards pretty decently. They could go a little further if I wanted to, but frankly, it doesn't look like the cuff kind of allows it. So that could have been just a little bit better as far as the refinement of the ankle ball joints, as well as the toes. Although this was also found on the 1.0, and it's also found on so many Mafexes that I'm starting to get just a little. I don't want to necessarily say annoyed because it's just the toe articulation, but there's a part of me that feels like Mafex needs to start changing it up and allow us to fully bend the toes instead of just making it go like that, like barely, like And I'm like, okay, then why give us toe articulation? Just cut it out, and to focus on other things, because if it's barely going to nudge, then it's really kind of almost pointless. Like, why is it even there? So I don't know. It's just a nitpick that I have. I know it's not necessarily at the top of a lot of people's lists when it comes to things that Mafex needs to change up, but it's still on the list. It's at the bottom, but it's on the list. Now, for a brief moment there, I mentioned that the hands can come off because of the articulation, and when you kind of flex a little bit on that hinge, they can slide off via the function to be able to swap out the hands. However, Mafex is generally known for throwing in a bunch of hands, and the 1.0 was not exactly any exception. They threw in quite an awful lot of hands, from open hands to, of course, the default fisted hands, clenching hands, and then gripping hands for the different accessories that he came with. That's probably the only other area beyond the colorway and the head sculpt that the 1.0 kind of pulled a little more through with the 2.0. And I know that there's different arguments that could be made as far as where we're at with the economy, with inflation, how they have to maybe cut back on certain things that they found to be a little bit too cost heavy. I don't know, but gotta be honest, a little disappointed that beyond the fisted hands that the 2.0 came with, he only really came with 3 other additional pair of hands. So just 3 versus everything that was coming here with the 1.0, which I believe it's like 5 additional pairs. So a grand total of 10 plus 2, 12 hands, I believe. 14, no, so 6 additional pairs. I just counted. This is 12 right here, plus those 2, 14. 14 total hands with different gestures, some of which even kind of look like they're pointing. Some of them have like the middle fingers kind of pressed in, almost looking like he's web shooting, but therefore different functions for the gadgets that I'm about to show off. Whereas with the 2.0, like I said, just 6 additional hands. Literally half the cost, or rather 6 plus the 2, there you have 8. So 8 versus 14. Almost half of the amount that we had going on for over here. And again, it's a little bit disappointing if I have to say so myself. I already mentioned the fisted hands that he came with default. On the side, he'll have the extending, reaching out hands for some kind of action pose or dynamic flying down pose, gliding pose. And then you have these gripping hands, and the gripping hands are for the grapple. which is very staple for any version of the Ben Affleck Batman character. And this is an accessory also carried on over from the original. Now, similar to the figure itself as far as the sculpting, to the naked eye, they look almost identical, but once you get up close, they did something similar to the grapple like they did with the figure itself, where they added maybe just a little bit of extra mass. We're talking like a fraction of a millimeter, like a tenth of a millimeter or so more of mass, and then beyond that, refined a little bit of the color scheming as far as that much more opaque kind of copper look to the silver as opposed to just a straight up silver that you had going on over here in the original. Paint apps, as far as the little accents with the black and even a little bit of the brown, almost look the same. The brown maybe looks a little darker. I can't tell if maybe that's a color hue change or simply just wear and tear. Apart from that, sculpting looks almost, like I said, identical except a few changes. It does look like this piece that's on the left side was a little refined. It's a little smaller, so they kind of pulled back a little bit there, but they added a bit more of the, like I said, a little bit more mass, about, like I said, a tenth, maybe a 15th or so of millimeter mass to the overall dimensions of the grapple. But still, they made it within the size or within the confines to fit into the gripping hand pair right here that you see before you. And right next to it, you have, I guess, technically another pair of holding hands. However, these are designed with a gesture that's a bit more on the narrow side. And if you couldn't already tell, that's going to be for the batarangs, which, again, I know I sound like a broken record, but at first glance, they don't really look like they're all that different. They're about the same size. However, what really impressed me is that beyond the obvious color change to kind of lean more towards that very opaque champagne kind of look to them as opposed to the silver they had on the original, you'll notice that they actually sculpted the ridge inside that's very staple for Ben Affleck's Batman to be a little bit wider, so it's a little bit stronger, if that makes any kind of sense, more dense, as opposed to the very thin and just kind of barely there cutout that you have in the middle of the original. So I'd like that even with something as small as the batarangs, they still looked at it and said, okay, can that be better? And they did. So pretty glad about that. And much like the original, these hands that are designed to hold the batarang in place via the thumb and the index finger, in my opinion, is probably one of the best renditions of this gesture to hold the batarangs. It just looks very natural, looks like a very organic way for the hand to kind of twist to hold batarangs as opposed to doing something like this, like, I gotta be honest, McFarlane or even at times Fonjoy has a tendency to do. And I partially alluded to this when I was covering the head joint, but you guys may have noticed that I said that if you tilt the head a little too far, it's gonna come off the peg because it does have a little bit more of a favorable joint to allow that to happen. So don't confuse it for being too loose. It's just there to make it a little easy to swap it for the alternate heads. And this is yet another area where maybe the 1.0 has a leg up because both of them came with alternate head sculpts. Now, it's funny because one traded quantity for quality. Yeah. And ironically, it's the 2.0 that opted for quantity as opposed to quality because you get two other cowled head sculpts for the 2.0. One of them has the grimace, teeth showing face, the very aggressive grimace with the teeth right there front and center. And then you have a yelling face, neither of which still manages to resemble Ben Affleck. It still has, like I said, something kind of off about the likeness. And I think one thing that just kind of throws me off is the fact that he's got kind of half closed eyes even when he's doing a very emotive expression like this, a very aggressive and angry one. So if you're going to be doing that, you got to open up the eyes a little bit, Mafex. You got to make sure that you have a little bit of life coming through on the facial expression. And even though the cowl was still sculpted pretty decently, they still managed to retain an awful lot of what worked over here. But the preference is still favoring that of the 1.0 because the 1.0 has a little bit of an aggressive look. Granted, they still also had the same problem of not opening the eyes with a much more grimace, teeth-showing face expression, but at the same time, you have a much more pointy and refined cowl sculpt as far as what you have going on here towards the top of the head. And then, like I mentioned before, the likeness, even though it's still not 100% there, it's still better than what we have going on over here as far as representation of Affleck. So this one only came with one added head for the cowled sculpt to change up the different expressions. 2.0 came with two, so you have at least one with teeth, one with yelling, and even the paint applications for the tongue inside is not too bad. It's just the fact that it doesn't look like Affleck, and you have the half-closed eyes that I'm like, oh, it's still kind of retaining a few of those problems. But at least you have options to kind of favor the lesser amount of hands. So I find that, like I said, a bit of a strange trade-off. So what else can 2.0 do to sweeten the deal? Well, they did an Affleck head, an unsculpted Affleck head, or so they say. So it's alleged because I gotta be honest, that's not Ben Affleck. Maybe a little bit around the chin and the cheek area. I can kind of sort of see it. But once we get up to the eyes, yeah, no. I mean, I appreciate that they try to do a little bit like a gray tone streak here on the side of the temples as well as the top of the head to kind of mimic that of an older Bruce. But overall, the paint applications are not that bad, but it's just the sculpting that's just completely off. That I'm like, nah, I'm sorry, but I'm just not buying it. Especially when mine also gets a little soured by a little bit of a QC issue right there on the forehead where you have a little bit of a black smudge. So mine came a little imperfect with that little QC problem. So double check your Affleck head sculpts. But even beyond that, when you finally do the head swap, the head is also just way too small, which is quite honestly strange considering how I was praising the bulkiness of this new 2.0. And yet when you add this head sculpt, it's someone online, I remember somebody, I think it was on Reddit, said that it looks like he's wearing a muscle suit. And it really does. You put the Affleck head sculpt on there, and he just looks like he's wearing a muscle suit. He looks way oversized for the type of head that they opted for the Ben Affleck head. So it looks like with the 1.0, which is very ironic, again, considering that back when they released the 1.0, when you had the 2017 Joss Whedon cut out there, I think they had an easier time finding likenesses to Ben Affleck's portrayal that I think the best time to have done an Affleck head sculpt would have been back then. But instead, they opted to do it now. But frankly, it looks worse now. I don't understand this logic. If anything, he looks more like, I'm blanking on Anson Mount. He looks like Anson Mount more than he looks Ben Affleck. If you guys don't know who Anson Mount is, he is Black Bolt in the Marvel Universe, in the Terrible Inhuman show, but also when he appeared briefly in Multiverse of Madness, in case you haven't seen that. But also, he's recently in the new Star Trek show, Star Trek New something, I can't remember, but he's the new Commander Pike. So if you look him up, he looks more like him than he does Ben Affleck. So I appreciate the effort, but at the same time, knowing that this was going to be lost when it comes to likeness and even a little bit of quality control, frankly, Mafex, I would have opted for the original gadgets and accessories that are frankly now missing here in the new one. And I'm not counting for the hands. I'm not talking about the hands. It's one thing to cut out the hands. At least it comes with the benefit of not having to keep track of them or lose them or anything like that. But you could have at least brought back either the grenade, which, yeah, it's just a sculpted black piece of plastic to resemble that of a grenade, which is fine. Okay, fine. You can go ahead and hold back on that one. But man, oh man, I would have appreciated the grenade launcher to have made a return here in the 2.0, because this is only included with the 1.0. So if you want it, you're either going to have to get the 1.0 or buy it piecemeal online somewhere, or maybe 3D print your own or commission someone to 3D print one, because that's the only real way that you're going to be able to get it. And it's decently sculpted and painted. It's still missing a bit of paint application as far as because the overall gray is pretty nice as far as the tone, but I would have appreciated a few little additional accents here towards the top or towards the sides. But just the fact that the 1.0 came with it, it would have been nice if maybe pulling back on the hands meant that this guy was going to be coming back. And sure, now owning both, I can kind of swap accessories, even swap heads, because I've already tried the Affleck head on the 1.0. And you guys remember how I was mentioning that the 1.0 is slimmed down versus the bulkier 2.0, and how this looks too small to fit on the 2.0? Well, I tried it, and sure enough, despite still not resembling Ben Affleck, that new unsculpted Ben Affleck head definitely looks a lot more at home with the 1.0. It actually complements the body a lot better. It fits more proportionally. And so there's so many mixed signals that I'm getting here when comparing the 1.0 to the 2.0 that I think we have yet to get the definitive Mafex Ben Affleck Batman. But that's not to say that Mafex didn't do a good job of refining the new one. I feel like still there has to be credit where credit is due as far as the little improvements they did to the sculpt, to the way that they kind of bulked up a little bit of the physique to resemble that of the Zack Snyder version that's meant to go a little harder than the 2017 version. But I just don't understand the change in the color scheming, the head sculpt, because frankly, I'm still of the mind that something is kind of iffy with the license to Afflex's likeness across different manufacturers, whether it be Mafex, McFarlane, maybe even Figuarts if they had something coming down the pipeline, and even Hot Toys, which is why we're getting, even with a 2.0 of the BVS, I still feel like something is just a little off with that head sculpt. And I feel like nothing that much different was happening here with the 2.0, because I appreciate the efforts to try to deliver on an Affleck head sculpt, but I rather would have taken the accessories that were kind of withheld this time around, or maybe even some of those additional hand accessories to kind of favor a little bit of the posability. But accessories aside, it really is that color scheme and that head sculpt. And granted, I'm able to fix the head sculpt via a head swap, but the color scheme, oh man, I just can't stop just thinking about what it would have been like if maybe we have gotten this colorway, this color scheme with this body and that head sculpt. That would have been enough for me. But there's still enough of a discrepancy here that if you missed out on either one, I would probably say that if you're on a budget and if luck happens to favor you, the gods are able to shine down on you with a very reliable and very understandable seller online that's willing to part with a Mafex 1.0 that isn't as flicked as mine, but still has a very good amount of the accessories, and the condition for the figure itself is also really top notch. I would still say get the 1.0 because of the much more favorable color scheme and the head sculpt, though you're going to be losing a little bit of the physicality. Whereas the 2.0 is at least the most available one right now in the standard market for the standard price, whether it be importing over from Hobby Link Japan or Hobby Genki, or maybe waiting to pick it up on BBTS or Entertainment Earth, which I think it's already readily available. It's already made its way to the States, so you're good to go there. You also can't go terribly wrong with 2.0 because you're still dealing with great sculpting as far as the, like I said, the physicality, the bulkiness, the muscle tone, and also the articulation. And the cape, despite being a little too long, is still of high quality with the pleather feel, the wiring. So you're not at a loss for getting either one. I just feel like if I was to recommend one, you know, dead to rights, it frankly still has to be the 1.0, but with an asterisk, which is that you need to really negotiate with whoever it is that they're selling, whoever's selling it in the aftermarket, because right now that's your only real way to pick this guy up. In the standard market, you can still do right by getting the 2.0. Just know a lot of these like little trade-offs and compromises that they had to do along the way. And it's those compromises that bring the 2.0 to a very low 8 out of 10. It was kind of teetering on 7, but ever so often I would swap out the hands to give him a very batarang throwing pose, or kind of making it seem like he's flying down with the grappler that I honestly did think looked pretty badass, especially keeping the neutral head sculpt on there, considering that he looks a little ugly with the open mouth, whether it be the grimace or the screaming face, but with the neutral one, I would say he still looks like Batman. And just keep in mind that regardless of what I just said about either one and the little qualities that they fell a little short on, just know that either one is still better than whatever the this is. This definitely needs a 2.0. If anything, if there's anything that either of these figures did, specifically the 2.0 of the Justice League Batman, it made it clear that this, the BVS Mafex, is in desperate need of a 2.0. And sadly, no, the Nightmare 2.0 that's coming out pretty soon, that just recently went up for pre-order, does not count. It maybe gives us a peek of what they're working on as far as the little bit of the suit that you can kind of see underneath the coat, but no, we need a definitive BVS 2.0 because, like I mentioned before, fusing these two together and maybe brightening up the suit to be of this gray with this texture and this head sculpt, well, as far as the design of the cowl, and just give us the quality of maybe this guy over here, oh man, I would definitely pay full price for that, because right now, like I said, this guy needs some help. He needs some help, Mafex. Do it, please. And that's the question that I have for you guys. Which Mafex figure needs a 2.0? Not just Batman, not just Spider-Man. Frankly, any character, any figure, any property that you're a fan of and you think to yourself, okay, that needs a refinement. Hell, I know the Mafex sometimes tackles other properties like The Boys and other properties. I think at one point they did maybe like a Rambo. Oh, Terminator. They do Terminator stuff. I think they have like maybe a couple of other Terminator stuff that coming down the pipeline, and so many other comic-based stuff as far as Marvel and DC that they're working on and kind of building prototypes on. So, what's a figure that you feel needs to go back to the drawing board, needs to be refined? Because much like with other companies like Hot Toys and etc. that are pumping out these 2.0s, these revisions with like artisan hair and refined head sculpts and such, what's one that needs to be overhauled? And you kind of already guessed which is my definitive vote. It's going to be this BVS Batman. It desperately needs it because right now as it stands, you just take a good look at him and it frankly looks like me. It looks like me wearing the suit. And that's not a good thing. That's not what Batfleck is supposed to be. Let me know down below which guys you guys want to see get a refinement of some sorts from Mafex. And while you're down there, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video. Thumbs down if you did not. As always, stay humble, and I'll catch you guys later. Take care.